As a rom-com, this one's abysmal. As a dramedy about grief, it's rather good.
Wait, how does she not know that her sister changed her number?
I'm gonna just see what's happening.
Hey, Iz. I'm just calling you to ask, how am I supposed to do this without you? You're in a better place.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today's video is a review of a new Netflix film called Voicemails for Isabelle. The premise reads, a woman's confessional voicemails to her late sister are unknowingly redirected to a stranger who begins to fall for her from afar. I'm going to get a bit pedantic here, but I think it's necessary if you're going to understand my point of view about this film and my view of rom-coms or romantic fiction in general. Rom-coms hit a particular boom, I would say beginning in the mid to late 1990s at earliest, but in particular starting in the early 2000s. By the time we hit the 2010s, the genre began to stall, and nowadays I often find myself demanding that we get more rom-coms, and in particular, rom-coms released in the cinema. You, Me, and Tuscany, one of my highest ranked films of 2026 thus far. One Night Only, one of my most anticipated films for the second half of 2026. This golden age of rom-coms had no shortage of heavily leaning into the comedic aspect of the storytelling. Even in the name romantic comedy, the word comedy is the subject, whereas the word romantic is a descriptor. As such, anytime a new film is released that sets out to advertise itself as a rom-com, and then it's actually a romantic drama with a bit of comedy occasionally sprinkled in, I rebuke those films attempting to claim the name rom-com. You are not funny, you are not whimsical, you are not delivering on the snappy banter, the hijinks, the physical comedy. You're not here to show the rom-com girlies a fun time. Voicemails for Isabelle, if you ask me to rate the film as a rom-com, I am throwing tomatoes, and I will explain why in this review. However, when I put aside my hostility at the incorrect labeling, I can give this film the credit it's due for being good. As a dramedy about a woman dealing with her grief at losing her younger sister, who was her best friend. Before we get into any of the specifics about plot or characters, that's the primary point I need to make clear so that any of my regular viewers who love to go looking for new romantic fiction to watch, or at the very least, something to watch that was made for the girls, you can all know what this film's strengths and weaknesses are. I will rate it as positive for what it actually is, instead of punishing it for failing at what the marketing is trying to sell it as. This review will have spoilers, by the way, because there is no way for me to effectively explain my points without specificity. When I first began watching Voicemails for Isabelle, I was operating under the assumption that it was setting out to be a rom-com because that's what all the marketing had been claiming. Imagine my surprise when the first 15 minutes or so is you meeting the protagonist Jill and her younger sister, the titular Isabelle, who goes by the nickname Izzy. They begin the film as children, they grow up together. Izzy suffers from cystic fibrosis, so she's mostly either at home or eventually we also see her at the hospital. We have this whole journey of following these two together, and then Izzy dies, which, to be fair, we knew was going to happen because it's baked into the premise, the trailer, the logline. This is by no means a spoiler. Jill is incredibly devastated by this loss. She gives an incredibly moving speech at Izzy's funeral, and then that grief is heavily baked into more or less the entire movie, her journey and arc as a character. Many a movie beloved by the girls involves someone being dead. Oftentimes it's a dead parent or two dead parents that have been formative to the female protagonist. Any and all adaptations or reimaginings of the Cinderella fairy tale have that. Brandy's Cinderella, Hilary Duff's Cinderella story, Anne Hathaway's Ella Enchanted, Anne Hathaway's Princess Diaries has that very moving letter that she reads, which is from her dead father. All of this to say that I am not knocking Voicemails for Isabelle out of the rom-com label for simply having a dead sister. However, the tone of this movie is so much sadder. You see the moment that the protagonist finds out her sister is dead. You see her devastated at the funeral, struggling in her life to keep going despite feeling overcome with grief. Again, in a dramedy about grief, this is all perfectly fine. There are funny moments to be found in this film, however, it's not a rom-com and you will not convince me otherwise. We can talk about some of the funnier aspects of the film. For example, Jill is an aspiring chef and currently she's working as a prep cook in the kitchen of Chef Bastien, who competed on some cooking competition television series, Top Chef or something like that. And Chef Bastien is played by Nick Offerman. He is a nightmare boss doing a funny accent. Close enough! Welcome back, Kevin Bacon, as Jorge in Beauty Shop.
Okay, so this is not the way we do things here at Jorge's, yeah?
In a way, it feels like they didn't make the most of the comedic potential that Nick Offerman had to offer in this character. But realistically, the greater issue is that this film falsely advertised itself as being a rom-com, thus creating the expectation of more comedy than the film was actually going to deliver. Jill has a series of bad hookups outside of her primary love interest, and this revolving door of losers is where you get a bountiful source of comedic shenanigans, at least relative to how much is present throughout the film. They're the ones that are given the room to be a bit more exaggerated, hyperbolic, something for the audience to find off-putting, but in a way that can act as a setup for those of us who are watching to get a laugh out of it. In going through this material, really analyzing the moving parts of this story, even though I will tilt my rating for this film to be more positive than negative, I would have been more consistently positive about this film if Jill's endgame love interest had simply been officially downgraded to be yet another one of the losers in her revolving door, and then her happy ending would be only focused on her feeling like she's made noticeable progress in working through her grief over losing her sister and taking these important steps with leaving a toxic work environment, as well as being able to pursue her dream on her own terms. As a matter of fact, I would have vastly preferred that they fully commit to the fact that this is a dramedy about grief and not a rom-com by giving far more scenes to Jill's dead sister Izzy. There's a phone call that happens in the beginning chapter of this film where Izzy calls Jill to tell her that her health has worsened. Ciara Bravo showed more emotion in this one phone call than Jill's endgame love interest Wes had in the entire movie. All of the sister material, all of the material where Jill is struggling to function, struggling to figure things out in her life, it was great. But anytime they would shift focus to Wes, trying to convince me that I should root for him and Jill to be a couple, the emotional momentum would completely stall. When I say that this is one of the worst performances I've seen from a leading man in a work of romantic fiction in recent memory, that is not an understatement. I was rewatching my press screener to try to organize some of my thoughts on the feedback that I would be sharing in my review, and the longer that I stared at this man's face, the more confused I became. His face was so expressionless. There was no fire in his eyes, no passion in any of his line delivery. The fact that the final push of this film, the final climactic rising action, is that this man is doing the signature rom-com lead has to run to find their love interest thing, it should be exciting. He finds her, he's going to make this big romantic declaration, and not a single word that came out of this man's mouth was believable. He even tells her, "I love you," and all I felt was confusion, irritation, and exasperation. I wanted the movie to be over at that point, because by then, Jill already had a satisfying arc for working through her grief, finding a different path to pursue her dream. I did not need this extra add-on of forcing these two to end up together. If you didn't already ascertain this information from the premise or the trailer, Wes gets a new work phone, and that mobile inherits what used to be Izzy's number. Jill has been calling Izzy's number since she passed away, and leaving her voicemails as a way of externalizing her grief. She's able to talk through her emotions out loud and feel like she's speaking to her sister regardless of not being able to hear her speak back. Wes is getting all of these voicemails, and he is charmed by all that he learns about Jill. He doesn't know at first that she's leaving voicemails to her dead sister. Initially, he thinks that she's just leaving voicemails for someone who has a new number now. Using what he learns from these voicemails, he's able to go and find Jill and meet her in real life and start something up with her. It's giving millennial reimagining of You've Got Mail, and the film is self-aware of this. They mention Meg Ryan, Tom Hanks, they mention several romantic films. It is not shying away from the meta-referencing of romantic fiction in the film medium. Already, though, you're off to a rough start with me because I don't like You've Got Mail. That premise was creepy then, and it's creepy now in Voicemails for Isabelle because I actually don't find the idea of a man knowing things about a woman and manipulating her into emotional intimacy to be all that romantic. And You've Got Mail is even worse because He was a corporate weirdo. Meg Ryan loses her small bookstore at the end because of the giant bookstore chain opening a location near her. I could not believe when I finally got around to watching You've Got Mail as an adult that the movie ends with her losing her bookstore, but at least she can get with this creepy corporate weirdo as her love interest. Gen X women, what exactly is the appeal there? Now, if you think hard about a lot of other romantic fiction in many a classic film, you can find plenty of creepy, problematic behavior, things that would not be enjoyable to experience if they were happening in real life. However, if the acting is phenomenal, the actors can make you emotionally buy into the connection between those two characters. If it's a romantic comedy, the comedy itself can heighten things in such a way that it doesn't have to be realistic. It just needs to be fun, funny, something to make you laugh. I'll give you an example. Alice and Janney in 10 Things I Hate About You. If a principal, a guidance counselor, really any sort of adult member of the staff at a high school was writing erotica out loud at school.
What's another word for engorged?
I'll look it up.
Okay.
That's extremely inappropriate and they should be fired. In 10 Things I Hate About You, it's a comedy and the writing style is such that almost every line coming out of any character's mouth is iconic enough to be quotable because it's heightened. There's an energy and tangible wit to the way people speak in that movie, and oftentimes the things people are doing are exaggerated because it's a comedy, and not only that, it's an adaptation of a Shakespeare comedy. It is not meant to be overly realistic. In Voicemails for Isabelle, Wes has the emotional range of stale bread. He's not funny, nor is he charming. There is absolutely no wiggle room to give him grace for being a creep in tracking down this girl and manipulating her into emotional intimacy the way that he did. If he could at least have made me laugh, I might have been more forgiving, but he did nothing but bore and irritate me. I would have cheered at the end of this movie if she had refused to go anywhere near him again. If you want to watch a thoughtful dramedy about grief and finding the right path towards healing and carrying on, and having a few laughs along the way, none of which involve Wes, watch Voicemails for Isabelle. If you're looking specifically for a rom-com about a girl dealing with grief and she's passionate about food and cooking, watch You, Me, and Tuscany.